We've had some pretty decent horrors and thrillers this year, and now we get Oddity. It's hitting theaters this week, and then will be available on Shudder in the fall. So, should you head to the theater to see this, or should you wait for streaming? A blind medium uncovers the truth behind her sister's death with the help of a frightening wooden object. So, Damian McCarthy directed this, and he also directed another atmospheric horror called Caveat. Now, the films share some elements, but they're not exactly sequels. I watched Oddity first, and then I watched Caveat, and both, they made perfect sense in that order. Now, I will be also dropping a separate review for Caveat so you can know if it's worth watching, but you can watch Oddity without having seen Caveat. Now, for Oddity, this mainly takes place in a very rustic and old home. The establishing shots and introduction to the story get us acquainted with the dwelling, showing us how it's dark, strange, and ominous. And this immediately sets the tone for the story. While it's not a massive dread that's present, there is an overwhelming sense of unease thanks to the isolation and the coldness that the house exudes. Now, the characters in this, they all come across as cagey. Not quite suspicious, but very peculiar and sketchy. Because the presentation of the film is quiet and patient, this works to enhance the oddness of each of the characters and draws attention to their idiosyncrasies more than it would have if the narrative had been loud and action-driven. Now, the story is a simple one, and it's fairly obvious with many of its points. But what it excels at is establishing this eerie feeling, and then maintaining that throughout the majority of the movie. From the opening scene, we're treated to this dark and shadowy hallway, filled with creaking sounds that just set your teeth on edge. And there's not a lot of dialogue at first, allowing us to just be enveloped by the setting. And it drew me in, almost like holding my breath, each moment ratcheting up the stress and anxiety until I was just about ready to burst. Now, I think you're going to figure out the mystery portion of this rather quickly. That's a bummer that the story doesn't obscure that portion more effectively. But even with knowing the answer to the riddles, there are still moments that you are either going to hope for or possibly not see coming straight away. And this helps to redeem some of the predictability, but not all of it. Now, there are a few jump scares in this, but they're not done in the cheap and messy way that we usually see them play out in lackluster horrors, like The Nun, for example, where, we absolutely know it's coming, and then there's this massive musical sting to accentuate the visual. It's typically the volume that creates the jump, not really any tension or terror. Now here, the story uses more restraint, and it builds out the landscape so that when we see something that's really less than desirable, that momentary freakout, it's earned and deserved. Now, as a plot device, the blind sister that comes for a visit brings this wooden object with her. This thing is a huge nope. Even when we just get a cursory glance, it raised the hair on my arms. And again, while we see the object much more directly later on, the story still uses restraint in what we actually see. And I think what becomes the most uncomfortable is the tricks that our eyes and minds play while watching. Don't get me wrong, the visuals, they're nightmare fuel, but it's more the possibility of what could be that makes it all the more scary. Now, the film has an odd costume design to it. While the story does play out in very modern times, characters, even locations, feel very antiquated and stuck in the past. And this messed with my head a bit because it felt like portions were out of time and space, even though there is enough evidence of this taking place in our present. This isn't a negative, or really even a positive. It's just something that stood out to me as slightly odd. For example, the dead sister's husband dresses like he's from the late 50s or maybe into the early 60s. He works at a place that really should be condemned just based on the condition of the walls and the floors. But then you have the dead sister, and she wouldn't stand out at all walking through a store, except maybe, the whole part about being dead, and people tend to freak out about that. You know what I mean, though. The one portion where this does make sense with the costumes and locations being old or aged is with the blind sister. Now, she's surrounded by things of the past, so it fits that she would also wear clothes from a bygone era. And I don't think any of this, again, detracts from the enjoyment of the arc, but the discrepancy in clothing and some of the sets, it did stand out to me. So when all this comes together, especially in the final act, we are treated to a chill-inducing sequence that is just rife with anxiety. And instead of rushing through the actions, the story deliberately moves step by step to dole out the discomfort. Now, I could have done without one small portion in the final act. It feels very spoon-fed. It was already obvious, and the audience is smart enough to understand how something came to be, so it was unnecessary. I know that was vague, and it's probably unhelpful too, but you see it when you see it. But there are some nail-biting moments that don't disappoint when it does come to Frightful Dread. Now, there's a repeated image that's used, and the lack of understanding or context for so much of the story, I thought it worked to add some questionable freakiness. I mean, at times it felt a little repetitious, but there is a sort of payoff as the narrative goes along. And I think the director was going for a less is more approach and showing us only a portion of an action and then letting our imaginations run wild with it. But for a horror that doesn't shy completely away from gore, it would have also been wonderful to watch something very horrific play out. Now, something I wouldn't have realized had I also not just watched Caveat is that both stories share similar premises, so it could create some disappointment if you've seen Caveat and then go to watch this. And I appreciate the spirit and some elements that work in both, so if you have not seen it, this is going to feel more fresh and unique than if you had watched. So overall, Oddity uses creative and disturbing visuals to craft a chilling thriller, effectively drawing on the isolated location and uneasy atmosphere to establish a dreadful tale. While the plot is more obvious and predictable than it should be, ultimately weakening the heart of the mystery, the quiet and eerie performances work to redeem the story, showcasing unwavering resolve in some and trepidation in others. For as much fun as this is, especially in the nope moments, I think I'd be disappointed in seeing this at full price. It's certainly worth a matinee, and then again when it comes to Shudder. There's no sex or nudity, some profanity, and then some gruesome violence. I give Oddity 3.5 out of 5 couches. So if you enjoy atmospheric horrors, this is definitely one to check out. Alright, so what has been your favorite horror or thriller from this year? Also, what are you still looking forward to seeing? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.